Despite being the big bad antagonist in the Bible and the greater Christian belief, you'd be hard-pressed to find a detailed description of Satan's physical characteristics within the pages of Scripture. In accordance with Christian traditions, many believe that this is because Satan does not have an original physical form, but that he can adopt forms in his efforts to deceive, like we see him do in the second book of Corinthians, where he masquerades as an angel of light. In the book of Revelation, meanwhile, we see the devil take on the form of a dragon to battle the Archangel Michael in the celestial war of the heavens. Yet we never see Satan described in the Bible as having horns, wielding a pitchfork, possessing hairy legs or hooves, or sharing any characteristics with that of the goat. Yet such imagery persisted as early as the Middle Ages, likely stemming first from Christian art, and later evolving into more folk traditions, where the goat and the devil began to dwell in the same semantic field. But why, I hear you ask? Of all the ferocious and cunning animals in the world, why on earth has the goat been historically associated with Satan? Well, it turns out that the goat may not have been as innocent and meek as it is often perceived, and may have had a bit of a reputation spanning even as far back as the ancient world. The 7th century scholar and Archbishop Isidore of Seville, for example, tells us in his etymology that the goat was a lascivious animal, and that it likes to butt heads and is always ready to mate. Goats don't come off too well in the biblical account either, where it is goats who are used to symbolize the sinful and subsequently banished into hellfire during the Last Judgment. So indeed there is some basis by which the goat can be symbolized as being more dubious in nature, and yet historians still struggle to really bridge the gap between the goat and Satan himself. Today we'll try and shine some light of our own as we delve into what exactly the Bible has to say about goats in general, as well as consulting Judaic and pagan traditions in an effort to establish just where this notion of the goat representing the devil sprouted up from, and what it means for the greater mythos. As you might imagine, the Bible doesn't specifically tell us anything in regards to the goat becoming an animal representation of the devil, nor are goats necessarily featured as villainous creatures. However, there is one passage in the Gospel of Matthew where goats do become symbolic for those who have sinned, and are effectively plunged into eternal hellfire. We are told first, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right, and the goats on his left. From this passage, we can quite easily see that Christ becomes a shepherd, and every human soul in existence becomes either a lamb or a goat, depending on whether they've been virtuous or not. Obviously, this is just a metaphor, a clever bit of imagery that would have indeed appealed to the contemporary audience of that time. As the passage goes, we learn that the righteous souls who have accepted Christ, the sheep, will be led to his right, and there they will experience eternal paradise. Yet those on the left, the goats, will go on to experience eternal damnation. Matthew tells us, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" Once more, this is only a metaphor for what believers determine will actually transpire in the end days, where Jesus will return and pick and choose who from amongst us is going with him to paradise. This segregation between the good and the evil is spoken about in a number of ways in the Bible, sometimes described as separating the weeds from the wheat, or the wheat from the chaff. It also implies that we, like the goats and the sheep, have no real idea of what's going on around us, and that we require a shepherd, or God in this instance, to divide us up based on our individual merits, and determine where it is we should be. It echoes the Christian sentiment that only God can judge, and with that, there is a humbling essence to the story that believers may find reassuring. Unfortunately, there isn't much else here to connect the idea of the goat to the devil. Indeed, the goats will be thrown into the eternal fire, along with the devil and all his angels, but there's not really enough here to warrant any significant association. One might say that because goats, as in sinners, will ultimately end up sharing the same fate as the devil, occupying the same space within the hellish fires for eternity, that the goat therefore can be seen as a symbol for one's union with the devil, or that perhaps the goat becomes something of a tongue-in-cheek mascot to represent the fate of those who follow Satan. There does exist some real-world ideas that also feed into this idea that the righteous souls would be sheep, whilst the sinful souls would be goats. Now, I'm no farmer or shepherd, and I don't exactly have any concrete sources for what I'm about to say, but apparently, domesticated sheep are fairly easy to organise and control in comparison to other farm animals. They're also not exactly the smartest animals, and they do depend on their shepherd for survival. I'm not sure what this says about the righteous few, though I imagine it's meant to reflect their innocence and devotedness to their lord, their shepherd. Goats, on the other hand, are a different beast from my understanding. They tend to be much more boisterous. They eat whatever they can get their mouths around, and during mating season, they tend to stink. Furthermore, these animals are known for being self-reliant and stubborn. I mean, what other animal do you know that does stuff like this for absolutely no reason? Whilst researching the difference between sheep and goats, I also learned that goats tend to be quite destructive. In fact, in an article, which I'll link in the description, the sentiment was that shepherds protect their sheep from their environment, whilst goat herds protect their environment from their goats. This could reflect the Christian belief that whilst believers, the sheep, are content to trust wholeheartedly in the shepherd, their lord, non-believers tend to take on the burden themselves, and like an early Jacob in the Genesis story, trust in their own ideas and schemes. One of the other biblical stories that springs to mind when talking about goats is the goat Daniel sees in one of his visions. He tells us of a somewhat more violent encounter with a creature that, unlike the account in Matthew, is much less docile in waiting for a shepherd to decide its destination, but instead much more aggressive. As I was thinking about this, suddenly, a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at it in a great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat kicked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Once more, it's tempting to look at this passage and attribute the goat here to something supernaturally evil, perhaps indeed something akin to the likes of Satan. And yet, going by the more popular interpretation of this passage, Daniel is referring here to Alexander the Great, he who brought about much destruction in his efforts to conquer the known world, and who also ushered in the great wave of Hellenism. So as far as the biblical account goes, goats do indeed get a bit of a bad rap. However, things do go from bad to worse when we consider some of the ancient traditions pertaining to the Jewish holiday Yom Kippur, otherwise known as the Day of Atonement. According to an ancient Second Temple period tradition, which is also described to us in Leviticus 16, a key part of the ceremony on this day was a sin offering involving 2 goats. These goats were brought to the high priest, and then lots were drawn to determine which one of these animals was going to be sacrificed to God and which one was going to symbolically absorb all the sins of the community. This goat, known as the Azazel goat, was then driven out into the desert, where it was plunged to its death. By some interpretations, this Azazel goat that had absorbed all of the Israelite sins was a symbolic beacon of Satan himself, which also lends to the imagery of Jesus finding Satan in the desert. This is yet another instance where Satan, or at least the evil of sin, goes hand in hand with the imagery of the goat. Why the sin of the Israelites had to be absorbed by a goat of all things is unclear. Perhaps it was to do with the fact that goats were easily obtainable for these ancient people, or that goats just happened to be the least liked animals of the herds, when we consider the aforementioned temperament of the animal. But in any case, you can certainly see why people by the medieval period had come to associate the goat to Satan, particularly this scapegoat Azazel, who was essentially embodied with evil and led off the side of a cliff. For those who have read the apocryphal book of Enoch, it's interesting that Azazel is also the name of the fallen angel who gives mankind weapons and teaches them how to make war with each other. Despite not being the leader of the fallen angels, who are seen to corrupt the mortal women and lead the world into chaos, Azazel nonetheless takes on much of the burden of punishment, and pretty much all of the transgressions committed by the fallen angels is ascribed unto him. In some ways, you might say that this Azazel was also a scapegoat for the other angels, who, though were punished, were not singled out as a symbol for everything that had gone wrong. According to another pseudepigraphical text known as the Greek Apocalypse of Baruch, we are shown visions of Baruch, who journeys with an angel through the layers of heaven, where in one layer he discovers oxen-faced men with the feet and legs of goats. These hybrids are believed in some interpretations to be demonic entities that assisted mankind in the building of the Tower of Babel. Such a creature that is half man and half goat might make us think of satyrs from Greek mythology. And believe it or not, there is yet another link we might find between the goat and Satan that centers around the Christian demonization of pagan gods from the Greek pantheon, particularly the satyr god Pan. Pan bore very similar characteristics to the goat variation of the devil that has since been impressed upon us. He was a being with horns, hooves, a tail, and was often or not particularly hairy. As far as their iconography goes, both characters do have many similarities, but where one entity was vilified and detested by their respective community, the other was worshipped and seen in many ways as a reflection of the natural beauty of the earth. Indeed, to the Greeks, Pan was a beloved entity and was so well received that he actually managed to become one of the only non-human looking characters to have been deified and widely worshipped. Yet to the Christians, Pan was an unusual nuisance, a troublesome figurehead that lingered amongst pagan communities and wasn't so easily stamped out compared to other deities in the pantheon. Indeed, for the likes of Zeus and Athena, their temples could be demolished and churches could be built in their wake, serving to remind Hellenistic societies as to who the real god was. But when it came to Pan, well, Pan had no temples. As a god of the wild, he simply existed in nature, in the forests, the waterfalls, the coasts. Wherever there was nature, Pan could be found, not at all unlike the narrative spun by the biblical god, who likewise was everywhere. As you can imagine, this made it pretty difficult for the Christians to destroy Pan, because physically, there was nothing for them to destroy. Therefore, a more psychological approach was needed to eradicate Pan from the minds of the Greeks, and that was to demonize him, to topple him from his status as a god and relegate him to that of something far more wicked. For Christians of the time, it wasn't that hard to vilify Pan and to cement the idea amongst their own communities that Pan was wicked, perhaps even equivalent to the devil. The goat features were already there, and even back in ancient times, it might not have been too much of a stretch for ancient believers to identify the similarities of a goat becoming the embodiment of sin in the Jewish tradition of Yom Kippur and the goat's features worn by Pan in Hellenistic culture. In fact, it's possible they wouldn't have considered this to be much of a coincidence, but in fact, evidence that the devil's preferred avatar was the goat. Furthermore, it didn't help Pan's case that his traits and mannerisms were of the antithesis of Christian ideals. Pan was a god often associated with fertility and sexuality, frequently depicted as being constantly aroused, and always ready for a game of hide the lucanako. In contrast, Christians practiced abstinence, restraint, and purity of the mind, body, and soul. Pan was already a substantial contradiction of all of these virtues, and encouraged his followers to do the exact opposite, which only fueled the urgency amongst church fathers and Christian authorities to stamp him out. What's more, the appearance of Pan, aside from his goat-like features, would have helped drive home this propaganda that he was an evil entity. A Christian audience would have associated divinity with the face of Christ, a perfect face that, going by early illustrations, was natural, devoid of blemishes, wounds, or defects, and most importantly, was very human. Pan was again the opposite of this. He was half man and half goat. He had horns sprouting from his head. He had a wild beard, a pug nose, cloven hooves, a tail, and pretty much ran about naked. Framing this character as wicked, and even associating him to the likes of the devil, wouldn't have been a particularly hard sell for Christian leaders. In fact, one might argue that the appearance of Pan was enough to solidify hostility within an early Christian audience. It should be noted, however, that the demonization of deities was not solely reserved for the likes of Pan. Pan just made it really easy because of how incongruent his character was with Christian ideals. Many Greek deities, as well as deities from other cultures, were all demonized amongst Christian communities. For example, Scripture itself implies that pagan deities from such people as the Canaanites were actually demons, who posed in the form of gods to trick people into sacrificing to them. By defaming these gods, and in the case of Pan, associating them to the likes of Satan, early Christians aimed to invalidate these religions that were otherwise alien to them, and to convert native worshippers, like the Greeks, into abandoning their evil and wicked gods, and to start worshipping one that was virtuous, benevolent, and one who would take them to an eternal paradise if they did. On the other hand though, there are historians who argue that the devil only became associated with Pan during neo-pagan revivals throughout Europe in the 19th century, those that deliberately used Pan's incompatibility with Christianity, as well as his perceived likeness to Satan, in an effort to challenge the predominant Christian belief at the time. One last article that speaks to the notion that the goat and the devil were indeed associated stems from the depiction of the entity Baphomet in 1861 by French occultist Eliphas Lévy. When Lévy published an occult book known as Transcendental Magic, the book contained an illustration of a humanoid goat known as the Sabbatic goat, which he then equated to as the Goat of Mendes. This likely stemmed from Lévy's knowledge of the works by Greek historian Herodotus, who noted that male goats were particularly revered in the ancient city of Mendes, an ancient Egyptian city. Here, the god of Mendes was depicted as having 4 goat heads and sometimes goat's legs. In any case, the image of this Goat of Mendes, later Baphomet in Lévy's works, would gain massive traction in the coming centuries, going on to be adopted by the Church of Satan and used as a symbol of independence, the rejection of superstition, and the rebellion against organized religion. With that in mind, we can see that once more, the goat gets itself in trouble again, and through no real fault of its own, is made into yet another symbol that not only serves as an opposition to Christianity, but also aligns itself with sin, godlessness, and ultimately, the devil. As we can see, the connection between the goat and the devil comes from a mix of religious beliefs, historical traditions, and changing cultural ideas. The Bible's use of the scapegoat, along with the demonization of pagan gods like Pan and the entity Baphomet, has helped shape the image of the goat as a symbol of sin and rebellion. Over time, we've seen this idea spread through art, literature, and folklore, and unfortunately for the goat, this is something that gained traction and never seemed to stop. Even today, there are many associations which pitch the goat as satanic, or as something akin to the devil, and what's more interesting is how quick we are to accept this, without necessarily knowing why the goat is universally lumped in with the devil. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to leave this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.